Hello, and welcome to Wisdom Life. Today we'll be discussing the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, a German thinker from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, developed a rather unique but notably bleak and pessimistic worldview. I'd like to introduce the core principles of his philosophy today because I believe they will offer you plenty to reflect upon. But first, who was Schopenhauer? Schopenhauer was an eccentric figure, both in his philosophy and his personality. He was quite bitter, highly misanthropic, and wasn't shy about directly confronting his intellectual opponents, sometimes resorting to personal insults. During his time, the most prominent philosopher was Hegel, whom Schopenhauer utterly despised. His dislike for Hegel was so strong that he even scheduled his own lectures at the University of Berlin at the exact same time as Hegel's, hoping to draw students away. Unfortunately for Schopenhauer, while Hegel's lecture hall was overflowing, Schopenhauer's was nearly empty. He referred to Hegel as a university philosopher, which in Schopenhauer's eyes was far from a compliment. To him, university philosophy was official, institutional philosophy, a mere extension of the state's ideology. He believed that a true philosopher couldn't be validated by the powers of the institution. If they were, they weren't a genuine philosopher. Schopenhauer was, therefore, a rebellious and defiant thinker, but perhaps also frustrated by the lack of recognition as a great philosopher during his lifetime. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Schopenhauer had a distinct worldview. Let's delve into it. His most well-known work is a monumental book titled The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818. In this book, he argues that the world we perceive around us is not the true reality. Instead, it's merely a surface layer or representation of the real world. Schopenhauer uses the term representation because the world as we perceive it is essentially how we represent it to ourselves. There are three primary characteristics of this world as representation. First, it is material. The world we perceive is a physical one, made up of tangible elements like earth, water, air, and so on. This is the same world that Plato called the sensible world. It's the material universe we can see and touch. The second characteristic is that this world is governed by the law of causality. That is, everything that happens has a cause. This makes the world rational and understandable. Scientists can study and comprehend the workings of the world precisely because it operates according to this rational law. If there were no causality, the world would be incomprehensible. Finally, the third characteristic of the world as representation is that it exists in space and time. Everything in this world occupies a particular space and exists within a specific time frame. This is why it's impossible for us to imagine something outside of space and time. Concepts like infinity or eternity are beyond our ability to fully grasp or visualize. Now, let's shift to Schopenhauer's concept of the world as will. When Schopenhauer speaks of will, he isn't referring to human will or intention. Instead, he means an underlying force or energy that animates everything in the universe. This will exists outside the boundaries of space and time, and as such, it's something our minds can't fully comprehend or represent. We can't mentally picture this will, but we can observe its effects, which manifest as the world of representation. In Schopenhauer's view, the will is the inner, hidden reality of the world, while the representation is merely its outward appearance, the surface layer. To explain this, Schopenhauer uses the analogy of the ocean. The surface of the ocean, which we can see and perceive, represents the world of appearance. However, the ocean's depths, which remain unseen and inaccessible to us, symbolize the world as will. We can observe the surface but can never truly access the deeper, more profound reality beneath it. For most of us, the world of representation is the only world we experience. When we see a tree, we think of it simply as a tree, not as a representation of something deeper. However, Schopenhauer argues that this perception is limited. There is a deeper reality, the will, that remains hidden beneath the surface. While scientific instruments may allow us to perceive things our senses can't, such as ultraviolet light or radio waves, they still don't grant us access to the will. Scientists study and produce knowledge about the material world, the world as representation. But Schopenhauer insists that this is only the surface of reality, and beneath it lies the true nature of existence. The will, an elusive force that defies our attempts to fully understand it. In essence, Schopenhauer tells us that what we perceive is just a world of illusions, a shallow version of reality. There is a deeper, more mysterious underworld that we can never fully access, which is the real essence of existence. Arthur Schopenhauer asserts that the human faculty of representation is not as significant as we might think. We tend to believe we are superior because of our consciousness, but this is a flawed assumption. Even though we can understand how the world operates, particularly through principles like causality, we are fundamentally unable to grasp its deeper meaning. While we've uncovered things like gravity, fluid mechanics, and evolution, the essential meaning of existence continues to elude us. Yes, we understand parts of how the world works, but we still can't answer the bigger questions, such as why the world exists in the first place. Why is there something rather than nothing? This is the metaphysical question posed by Leibniz, one that remains unanswered. Claiming human superiority based on our ability to understand how the world works is therefore misguided. At best, we understand the surface level of reality, but to comprehend its true essence and depth, we would need to penetrate what Schopenhauer calls the will of the world, and we are structurally incapable of doing so. If this will is inaccessible to us, if we can know nothing of it, what can we even say about it? Schopenhauer doesn't contradict himself here because he distinguishes between the world as representation and the world as will. The world as representation is a manifestation of the world as will. And as humans, products of the world, we are also manifestations of this will. Therefore, if we truly understood ourselves, we might understand an aspect of this will, the part of the will that manifests through us. So, what does man truly know about himself? The most basic fact is that we are alive. But when we ask why we live, things become more complex. While some might point to evolution, amino acids, and proteins as the origins of life, these explanations tell us how life began, not why. For Schopenhauer, the answer lies in the will. It is this will that drives existence and life itself. Life's primary instinct is to perpetuate itself, and in animals, this happens through reproduction. This reproductive instinct is part of a larger survival instinct. Without reproduction, a species would face extinction. Thus, from a biological perspective, sex is not merely about pleasure but about species preservation. This, Schopenhauer says, is something we must keep in mind. We may not know the ultimate purpose of life, but the drive to perpetuate itself is undeniable. This drive is the will in action, an absurd force seeking its indefinite continuation. In this sense, we are merely instruments of the will, perpetuating it through reproduction. While this idea may disturb us, challenging our belief in free will, Schopenhauer asserts that we are not truly free. We are driven by the will, which determines what we want and how we act. Sexual desire, for example, isn't something we rationally choose. It's an impulse rooted in the will, compelling us toward reproduction. While modern contraception allows us to separate sex from reproduction, this was not always the case. For millions of years, sexuality and reproduction were inherently linked. Our belief in personal freedom is, for Schopenhauer, an illusion. We unknowingly follow the will's commands, thinking we are making our own choices. If we were aware of this truth, perhaps we would resist it, stop reproducing, and refuse to perpetuate the absurdity of life. Schopenhauer uses the metaphor of Kaiser Soze, a mysterious criminal mastermind from The Usual Suspects, to illustrate how the will operates. Just as people work for Soze without knowing they're doing so, humans serve the will without realizing it. We reproduce willingly, unaware that we are perpetuating something beyond ourselves. This leads to an interesting aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy: love. For him, love is just another illusion, a trick of the will to ensure the continuation of life. When we fall in love, it drives us toward union, and from this union, children are born. Love, then, is the will's way of ensuring its own perpetuation. Schopenhauer argues that love and sexual desire are essentially the same thing, with love being the socially acceptable version of desire. Human intelligence, Schopenhauer argues, is adept at creating illusions that mask our animal nature. We refuse to see ourselves as purely instinct-driven beings, even though deep down that's exactly what we are. Seduction, for instance, is a more sophisticated form of the animal drive to reproduce, hidden behind the facade of romance and affection. Schopenhauer's view of existence is ultimately tragic. Life, according to him, is an absurd, endless cycle of suffering and boredom. Despite this, we continue to reproduce, perpetuating the will's cycle. The occasional moments of happiness or aesthetic beauty are fleeting. Beyond that, life offers little to hope for. Schopenhauer's conclusion is that the only logical response to life's absurdity is to cease reproducing and end the cycle of suffering.